Now over to what's happening in Saskatchewan. Welcome to Canada News Summaries. I'm Mike, and with me today is Jane.
Hey, everyone.
All right, Jane. We've got a story out of Prince Albert that's taken a turn I really wasn't expecting. It started as a death in police custody, but now the charges against the officer have been stayed.
It's definitely a case that raises a lot of questions. Where do you even begin with something like this?
Well, to set the scene, we need to rewind back to November 2021. A 33-year-old man named Saul Liberté died while in police custody in Prince Albert. What we know is that he turned himself in to the police on some outstanding warrants.
Right, and from what I understand, he was later found unresponsive in his cell.
Yeah.
Sadly, he died in the hospital. It's just a tragic situation all around.
Absolutely. And what makes it even more complex is that Sergeant Tyson Rash, an officer with the Prince Albert Police, was charged in connection with Liberté's death.
And it wasn't just one charge, was it? He was facing criminal negligence, causing death, and failing to provide the necessities of life.
You've got it. And those are some serious charges. To me, it really seemed like the prosecution was building a solid case.
Yeah, they don't bring charges like that lightly. Criminal negligence causing death implies that the officer's actions, or in this case, inaction, played a major role in the death.
And to add to that, failing to provide the necessities of life suggests a really serious breach of duty of care. You have to wonder what kind of evidence they had to bring charges this heavy.
Exactly. Initially, it seemed like this was going to go to trial, so we could really dig into what happened in that jail cell.
But then things get really interesting, Jane. Because just last month, December 2024, those charges against Sergeant Marash were stayed.
Yeah, that's where things get complicated. For anyone who may not know, a stay of charges doesn't mean the charges are dropped entirely. It essentially puts a halt to the prosecution as it stands.
Okay, so then naturally the question becomes, why? Why were the charges stayed after all this time? What was the reasoning?
Well, Saskatchewan Justice put out a statement explaining that they reviewed the case to see if it still met the standard for prosecution. They concluded that there was no reasonable likelihood of conviction.
No reasonable likelihood of conviction. That's a pretty bold statement. What does that even mean in a case like this?
It's tough to say without knowing exactly what evidence Saskatchewan Justice reviewed. But to reach that conclusion, there must have been some pretty significant factors that weren't initially apparent, right? Factors that changed the whole assessment of the case.
You're telling me it's almost like a piece of the puzzle is missing.
And not only that, they also said that there wasn't enough public interest in the case to proceed.
Wait, hold on. No public interest. So even if they thought they could win a conviction, they wouldn't have pursued it.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's more to this story.
I'd say so. Yeah, it makes you think about the whole idea of transparency when it comes to these investigations.
Transparency. I mean, it's one thing to say justice has been served. But how can you tell if that's true if things aren't out in the open?
That's the heart of it, right? How can the public have faith in the outcome when they're not privy to the details? It's like they're saying, trust us, but without any real explanation.
So how do we know what they base their decision on? I mean, I get that they can't release everything, but some level of detail would go a long way.
Right. Think about it. Saskatchewan Justice says no reasonable likelihood of conviction. But what does that mean in this specific instance? What exactly did their review turn up? What led them to believe that a conviction was unlikely?
It's frustrating because without that context, we're left speculating. It feels like there's a whole chapter missing from the story.
Exactly. What about the original investigation into Mr. Liberté's death? Were there expert reports, witness testimonies? Were those things reevaluated? Did new evidence come to light?
Those are the details that would help us understand how they arrived at this decision. Without that, it's hard to shake the feeling that something isn't quite right.
And that lack of transparency can be really damaging, especially in cases involving law enforcement. It feeds into this perception that there's a lack of accountability, or even worse, that there's something being hidden from the public.
That's a slippery slope. I think it's important to remember that most law enforcement officers are out there doing a difficult job, putting their lives on the line every day.
Of course. They deserve our respect. But when things like this happen and the details are kept under wraps, it casts a shadow over the entire system.
You're right. It makes it harder for everyone, the police included. So what's the solution? How do we balance the need for thorough investigations with the public's right to know?
Well, I think one big step would be greater access to information. Releasing more detailed reports, even redacted versions, could shed light on the process and the reasoning behind decisions like this.
That would make a huge difference. It wouldn't compromise the integrity of the investigation, but it would give the public a better understanding of how they got from point A to point B.
Exactly. And another thing that can be helpful is having more independent oversight of these investigations.
You need a third party? Someone outside of law enforcement?
Right. Having an independent body involved could help ensure impartiality and increase public confidence that everything is being done above board.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It would add another layer of accountability and help build trust.
Yeah. It's
No.
easy to get lost in all the legal stuff. But, at the end of the day, this is a human tragedy.
Absolutely. Saul Lauerte was somebody's son, maybe a brother, a friend, you know? And his life mattered, and his death deserves a thorough and transparent investigation.
I keep thinking about his family and what they must be going through, right? To have these charges stayed after all this time, it's like, are they ever going to get answers?
You know, it must feel like a slap in the face, honestly. They're left with so many unanswered questions, and it's hard to see how they can feel any sense of closure or justice.
Really makes you wonder what can be done to prevent these kinds of situations from happening again. What can we do to prevent tragedies like this? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There are so many factors involved. Better training for law enforcement for sure, more mental health resources, a more humane approach when it comes to people in crisis.
And maybe even taking a hard look at some of the systemic issues, too,
Hmm.
right? Like implicit bias, systemic racism.
Absolutely. We can't ignore those things. We need to acknowledge that certain groups are disproportionately represented in the justice system and really understand the reasons behind it.
This isn't a one-time conversation either. This
Yeah.
is something we need to keep talking about until we find solutions.
Exactly. And it's a conversation that needs to involve everyone: law enforcement, policymakers, community leaders, everyday people like us.
Yeah, it needs to be rooted in empathy and a real commitment to finding solutions that work.
Well said. This has been a heavy conversation, but I think an important one.
I agree. And to all our listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us on Canada News Summaries. If this story has raised any questions for you, please share them in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.
We always appreciate hearing your thoughts.
And don't forget to follow, like, and share this podcast with others. We'll be back soon with more news from across Canada. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged.